Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Tacketts from George Mason University and the Center for History. I'm Sean Tacketts from George Mason University and the Center for History and New Media. I'm delighted to introduce this panel today on digital tools for research and teaching. A few bright spots notwithstanding, French historians not exactly known for their embrace of technology in research and teaching. And so I'm especially excited to see these two early career scholars who have assumed a real risk in taking a non-traditional approach in their own research, but a risk that I have no doubt will be richly rewarded. Today's beginning will be Chris Church. Chris is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley with a dissertation titled The Politics of Disaster in a Colony of Citizens, Compatriotism, Citizenship, and Catastrophe in French Martinique, 1870 to 1902. Chris has given numerous presentations on digital and traditional research which center on 19th century Martinique. He has an article forthcoming, Strikingly French, Labor Unrest, Metropolitan Politics in Martinique at the Turn of the Century. He's also apparently an expert on Richard Pryor and REST APIs, and we can't fault him for either of those. Today he's going to speak to us on language of citizenship and the calculus of disaster, civic duty and economics following the 1891 hurricane in the French Antilles. I give you Chris Church.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Church from the University of California, Berkeley, and today I'll be presenting on civic duty and economics following the 1891 hurricane in the French Antilles, specifically talking about the use of natural language processing and the exploration of the language of citizenship against a calculus of disaster. That is, Republican ideology and the discourse of civic inclusion against the economic realities of colonialism at the end of the century, end of the 19th century. This is a project that grows out of my dissertation on environment, French nationalism, and colonialism at the end of the 19th century. And it began this past summer with some seed funding and support from the Student Mentoring and Research Teams program at Berkeley. It began as a pilot program, as a proof of concept with an undergraduate researcher who is in the audience today, as well as technological support from the Social Science Data Lab, or D-Lab, where I work. And today what I'm going to do is talk about the historical context, the genesis of my research question for this project, talking about why it matters. And then I'm going to talk about my methodological approach and delineate between close and distant reading. I'm going to provide some of my preliminary findings from the project. And I have to stress here these are preliminary findings because the project is still only a few months young. And then I'm going to close with the path forward for my project, what the next steps are, as well as some general conclusions about the digital humanities and its implications for historical scholarship. So why Martinique? Well, Martinique is a colony of citizens, to borrow a term from Laurent Dubois in his work on Guadeloupe during the French Revolution. And I think this is a great term for encapsulating the duality of the island. On the one hand, it's a colony. It's rooted in a legacy of forced migration, plantation slavery, and sugar cultivation, of economic exploitation for economic gain. But on the other hand, it's full of citizens, a population that's 95% non-white, the descendants of slaves and more recently of indentured servants. This colony by the Third Republic had been legislatively incorporated into France. Its population possessed full manhood, universal manhood suffrage. And more than that, it was culturally construed as this place that was simultaneously French and yet very foreign. It was tropical, but at the same time a bastion of French civilization in the tropics. And Republicans actually actively tried to recast this island as a colony of settlement, as an extension of French civilization abroad, despite the economic realities of it throughout the 19th century. And they did this precisely because this was a period where nationalism was at its height, and new imperialism was extending the French Empire to its greatest extent. And subjects were made all across the globe, French subjects. But at the same time, as Weber reminds us, this is the period when the French nation became what we would identify today as a French nation. It was knitted together by railway lines and coal mines, through the school system, through transportation networks, as well as mandatory military service. And Martinique played a constituent, if fitful, part in this process. as it was simultaneously incorporated into what we would identify as a French nation, but at the same time relegated due to its economic status and that legacy of plantation slavery. And disasters are a key point to look at, a lens through which to examine this process, because they're precisely the moments of crisis that bring the relationship of the government to its citizenry to the public sphere. It's at those points that it's most public, the relationship between the citizenry and the government and the promise of the government. The government then, in the context of liberal economics, of government non-intervention, of free market capitalism, has to reckon with things like social justice, social welfare, and the demands for a social republic. And in so doing, in this colony of citizens where it's most heightened and most extreme, in turn redefines what it means to be a French citizen at the close of the 19th century, not just in the colony of citizens, but more broadly in the context of industrial disasters in France. Which brings me to the 1891 hurricane. This is a significant event in the history of the French Antilles because it's a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds up to 129 miles an hour that on the night of 18 August 1891 smashed into Martinique and within a matter of hours had destroyed 88 million francs worth of property and homes. It had set back the Martinique economy by about 5 years, completely wiping out the 1891 sugar harvest and displacing thousands upon thousands from their homes from flood zones. And basically what happens, whoops, I have a little bit of a technical problem. The French government's response is enlightening, if a bit peculiar. They send a colonial investigatory team headed by Émile Chaudier to carry out what Chaudier himself describes as an evaluative work, not personal, but based on statistical givens. And his essential aim is to figure out, like a surgeon with a scalpel, how he can cut the fat from the 88 million franc estimation by the local government as he searches for the least amount of capital that the French government needs to re-inject into the economy of Martinique in order to get it back to its pre-18 August status. And as he's doing so, he searches for, as well as his counterparts in the chambers of commerce in Bordeaux and Le Havre and Marseille, is there a point of diminishing returns? Is there a point at which it is no longer sustainable or economically worth it to the investors to re-inject that capital? Essentially, the status of Martinique as a part of France becomes predicated on its economic vitality. But what makes this so peculiar, is interlaced with this exact calculus of disaster, is this language of civic inclusion. Not just in official press releases by the government, not just in journalists' understanding of it in the press, but even in the works of Chaudier and the missives between him and the Undersecretary of the colony itself. The Chamber of Commerce of Bordeaux, for example, starts off with several paragraphs in one of its internal internal notes, about just how French this location is. And despite all this, we still have to come back to economics. But this got me thinking about what, as many colonial historians have, what does it mean to have a republican empire? What is the nature of it? What is the ideology of an empire that dealt with both citizens and subjects? And what is it in its broadest cultural sense? What is the cultural milieu? And as I wondered about that, I ran up against what I've termed, not to Bernard Porter's knowledge, but the Bernard Porter problem. About a decade ago, he published The Absent-Minded Imperialists, in which he took colonial historians to task for essentially overplaying their hand, or, for lack of a better term, cherry-picking, of saying that, overstating the importance of the colonies to national history because they hadn't looked at it in context. They hadn't looked at, say, cultural production about the colonies within the context of all cultural production possible throughout the 19th century. Now, while Bernard Porter's criticism is directly applicable to the British Empire, which is what his book is about, it does raise some interesting problems for historians of the French colonies. And this is the jumping off point for this project. Because I feel that we are now at a point 10 years out where the digital humanities does offer some solutions to those problems. In just the last 10 years, we've gone from gigabytes to terabytes to petabytes worth of data online as libraries carry out massive digitization projects. Moreover, the source material keeps expanding because young scholars go to archives rather than having a notebook in hand and a pen. They go with a laptop and a digital camera. I alone have 120 gigabytes worth of textual data on my computer alone. And the problem isn't a dearth of source material. Far from it. It's actually what to do with so much source material. And I think what you can do with it is try to get a broader cultural context to figure out what is Republican ideology in a cultural milieu. And to do so, this project uses a process known as distant reading. Distant reading is coined by Stanford literary scholar Franco Moretti. And what he means by it is actually the process of precisely not reading a text, of not starting at the top left-hand corner of a page, proceeding left to right, top to bottom, but to treat text as data, as points on a graph, to treat it holistically or systematically. And what I see this as an intervention analogous to that made by the Annales School. So whereas the Annales School changed our proximity to the historical event, arguing for a broader chronological scope where we can look at historical change over time, far removed in a much wider time frame, distant reading encourages us to take a step back from texts, to distance ourselves critically from text in order to map something entirely different. Now forgive me as I use an example using the Great Wall of China in an infographic. I see this as a continuum of knowing from close to distant. Now you could know the Great Wall of China by standing on it, by examining its architecture, by looking at its bricks, by looking over the side to get a very intimate and real sense of how high it is, walking along it for several hours to get an excruciatingly true sense of just how big it is. And this would be akin to what we do when we go into an archive, when we closely read archival documents. We read a single manuscript or a collection of governmental documents, and we do so very, very closely. But the problem with that is it doesn't give you a sense of, say, how the Great Wall of China follows the contours of the landscape. To do so, you'd have to take a helicopter ride over the Great Wall of China. And then in doing so, you'd see how it traces the topography. You'd get a much broader context for how long it is. And this could be akin to flipping through a carton of documents very quickly to see what it contains, or to try to do a larger overview of kind of what is the context. But this is precisely where Bernard Porter is the Bernard Porter problem starts to raise its head. And I feel that this is, these two blocks of this infographic are where we currently most comfortably operate. And what this project is looking for is something different. This last one, which is a map of the Great Wall of China. And what it tells you are things that are entirely absent from the first two. It tells you about the geopolitics of the region. It tells you about how it traces and transgresses political boundaries, how it fits into trade networks. And what's interesting, though, is that it's completely meaningless without the first two. If I've never seen the Great Wall of China, let alone a picture of the Great Wall of China, and I've only ever seen a map, it would mean nothing to me. I would have no sense of what the Great Wall of China is. But if I have, and then I see the map, it tells me something completely different, something systematic, something that cues me into something I wouldn't have seen before. And so I have to stress here that the importance of the methodology I'm using in this project is starting with the close reading first, then proceeding from that critical distance, looking at something holistically, but then returning and trying to tie that back down to something concrete, something real. So what did we do? As I said, this started out as a proof of concept with an undergraduate research assistant. And what we did was we took two pivotal Caribbean newspapers, Les Colonies, which was the Republican mouthpiece on the island of Martinique, as well as Les Antilles, which was the conservative journal on the island. And we started to take scans of those newspapers and convert them into XML, or extensible markup language, which for our purposes today simply means structured textual data. And what that allowed us to do is then use something called the Natural Language Toolkit, which is a programming library for the Python programming language that allows us to explore algorithmically human language. And we did this through a couple of different techniques. We used concordance, which is essentially looking at keyword and context. It's an exploratory technique to see, say, for example, how is the word disaster used across not 1, 2, 10, but perhaps 100 different texts. And then in that sense, it's maybe on the continuum closer to close reading. We also looked at word frequency, which are what are the words that show up most frequent? What are the defining characteristic words after you remove stop words like articles of, of, and, but, conjunctions. We also looked at collocation, which is the association between words. What are the associations between cultural concepts in the broader context of Republican ideology? For example, what words are associated with the people of Martinique as opposed to with the properties that were destroyed? And finally, we did some sentence parsing. What are the nouns? What are the objects? what are the predicate nominatives. And what this allowed us to do is ask questions like, what are all the adjectives that describe the disaster in Martinique? Or what are all the adjectives that describe the population of Martinique? And then once we had done that, we started visualizing. We started to create those maps of the Great Wall of China, as it were, using a program called Gephi, which is a network analysis tool and visualization tool, as well as another Python programming library called Matplotlib, which allows you to dynamically create maps, graphs, charts based on your data. Now here's some of our preliminary findings. And again, I have to stress these are preliminary, but we can already see some interesting trends. This is a collocation networks of bigrams, so two words associated with one another. And what you can see is that the adjective Martiniquais is most closely associated with commerce and workers. So that in press coverage about this natural disaster, people are most concerned when they're describing the Martiniquais with commerce and with work. We can also see a focus on the great number, kind of the sheer magnitude of this disaster, but also the great number of pieces of property that were destroyed. If we were to look at the top 25 words, we see a slightly different picture that actually does get at that uneasy tension of Republican civic inclusion against economic reality. We start to see words like population and people. We start to see commune. We start to see villages and aid. But if we drill in a little more deeply, say we go into pays, the countryside, we see it's closely associated with the word prosperity, again hearkening back to that economic necessity. We also see deer closely associated with both Martinique and the people of Martinique. And this is something that came up repeatedly in the close reading of, often it was repeated that this was one of the oldest and most dear of the French colonies. And this always preceded a reiteration of concitoyenneté and compatriotism with these people. But what are the challenges? Well, at this point, I want to reiterate the old programmer's adage, garbage in, garbage out. So it took us over 200 hours just to encode 3 works worth of data. And the charts I just showed you are based off of only 1 week worth of press coverage. So it's important to make sure that the data that you're putting into the system, but when you start analyzing it algorithmically, is reliable and that it's sufficient, that you have enough data points in order to draw reliable conclusions. Moreover, we hit a pretty early speed bump. We had intended to use OCR text, which is optical character recognition, text that's made machine readable by machines from the National French Library. And we actually have 2 gigabytes worth of this OCR text. Unfortunately, not only is it messy with a bunch of other characters and improperly closed sentences, it also is fragmentary. The OCR text actually stops August 1891 and doesn't pick up again until February 1892. The Tesseract algorithm actually completely failed, and it would be so labor intensive to go back and to fix that. So this is another point that I want to draw, is that this new methodology does not reduce the amount of labor involved. It just changes it. It magnifies it. It's a both and problem rather than an either or. That you now, in addition to having a close, intimate knowledge of the archival record, you require things like statistical knowledge, programming languages. You need IT support for your hardware. So what are the next steps for this project given these challenges? Well, one is to just continue validating and encoding data sets, get more data to put into the system so that we can start reliably drawing conclusions about Republican ideology. And to do so, we need to assemble a team that has diverse skill sets, but also to seek out things like crowdsourcing solutions to cut down on the overall labor of our team that is interested in historical questions and displace that so that we can get machine-readable text from the start. And then that machine-readable text can then be plugged in and encoded reliably and then plugged into the system. And all of this requires a diversity of skills and begs for a laboratory-based model of historical scholarship, no longer the lone scholar going through the archive, but the lone scholar going through the archive and then branching out and collaborating with a whole team of other scholars with a diverse skill set. And then the last step is to get these data sets on the web. Once they've been validated and proven to be reliable, to put them on the internet, both in XML so that future scholars or other scholars can come through and collaborate, download my data sets and run their own analyses, but also in HTML so that the public as well as other scholars can just go read these now available transcribed versions of newspaper and press about 19th century disasters. So why do it? Well, one, and I've hinted at this before, is reproducibility. That it's no longer about the scholar's intimate knowledge that's not necessarily shareable or translatable. Unfortunately, I can't open my head and let you see what I've read. However, what I can do is allow you to get access to the same sources that I've used, to share them with you, and then provide you with my methodology and allow you to see exactly what I saw. So for example, you can go on GitHub, you can download, once they're available, the XML encoded data that we've used. You can then download the programming code that I've used to generate my analysis, and you can run it and see the exact same charts that my research assistant and I saw. But more importantly, as we get to 6 months worth of press, which is the ultimate goal for this project, we can rerun the same thing we ran at 1 week. And we can see how that's changed. And someone else can build on it. It's extensible. So if somebody else comes along and has 6 more months worth of data, or 6 months worth of data on a different topic, they can run the exact same methodology that I used on that data and see how it bears out. It may be about a disaster, it may be about something else that was covered in the press, but they can use it in the same fashion. Also, it gets around the Bernard Porter problem. It gets around cherry-picking examples, or the plural of anecdote is not data. And so I throw that out there as a fairly controversial statement, but the idea is that to get at something as vast, as contextual, and as systematic as a Republican ideology that kind of pervaded several decades, you need something that's more holistic, more systematic, that allows you to see kind of a roadmap of public discourse. And that's what this offers. Rather than taking one piece of data or one cherry or two or even a handful, taking thousands, and hopefully as we continue to digitize things, hundreds of thousands. And to do so would allow us to draw bird's-eye conclusions about the importance of colonial disasters like the 1891 hurricane, their resonance and impact in public discourse in France. So I want to end with a closing statement, and that is that history cannot be understood algorithmically, although algorithms can be used to enhance and broaden our understanding of history and start to allow us to answer questions that just 10 years ago seemed unanswerable. Thank you.